Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it is time to keep Series 13 of the TTT going as we start Week 98 with another Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, we've spent a lot of time in Gondor, folks, and all of it so far in the region of Anorion. And today, we'll still start in the region before we finally begin to look east towards Ithilien. Now, last week, we finished up our 3 weeks in the city of Minas Tirith, but let's begin this week with a look at the port that helps keep this city fed. Now, of course, that is the Harlond, the port and docks of the city of Minas Tirith, used by the river traffic coming up the Anduin from the southern regions of Gondor, and we'll get to those southern regions probably next series. Now, before we look at the Harlond, and I confess there's not a lot to look at, if the name sounds familiar, it's because it is. Up in the north, near the Grey Havens, there are actually 3 havens of the elves: Mithlond, the Grey Havens, Forlond to the north, and Harlond to the south. And that's just because the name Harlond is Sindarin for South Haven, from Harn, south, like Harad, and Lond, haven, like Ethelond or Londyre. So, these 2 harbors share a name, South Haven, but that's it. Now, we don't see the Harlond in the text very often, but let's get our first glimpse of it in the description of the Ramas Echor surrounding the Pelennor and the White City. At its nearest point, the wall was little more than 1 league, that's a little bit more than 3 miles, from the city, and that was southeastward. There, Anduin, going in a wide knee about the hills of Emin Arnan in South Ithilien, bent sharply west, and the outwall rose upon its very brink. And beneath it lay the quays and landings of the Harlond for craft that came upstream from the southern fiefs. That's really it for describing it. We're never given any information as to whether it was built at the same time as Minas Tirith, then known as Minas Anor, was built, or whether it came before or after. However, given that Pelargir was built a lot earlier, in Second Age 2350, it strikes me as possible that the haven might have actually predated the city, just a minor port on the Anduin located at a strategically important bend in the river. After all, we know that Pelargir was roughly 126 miles south of the Harlond, certainly far enough away to justify the building of another harbor for ships traveling north up the river. But honestly, we're never told that in any way whatsoever, so that's Alan's Middle-earth Making It Up Monday. Now, what else we know about the Harlond is that it was the site of the real turning point of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. First, when Eomer was barely a mile away from the Harlond, he looked to the river, and hope died in his heart, and the wind that he had blessed he now called accursed, because he saw the black sails of the dreaded corsairs of Umbar. But when Aragorn revealed his great standard, there flowered a white tree, and that was for Gondor. But 7 stars were about it, and a high crown above it, the signs of Elendil that no lord had borne for years beyond count. Everything changed. The eucatastrophe, the moment that turns the tide, starts at the Harlond. For now, men leaped from the ships to the quays of the Harlond and swept north like a storm. There came Legolas, and Gimli wielding his axe, and Halbarad with the standard, and Elladan and Elrohir with stars on their brow, and the dour-handed Dunedain, rangers of the north, leading a great valor of the folk of Lobendon and Lamadon and the fiefs of the south. But before all went Aragorn with the flame of the west, Anduril like a new fire kindled, Narsil reforged, as deadly as of old, and upon his brow was the star of Elendil, which of course we looked at last series. Now, that does it for the Harlond, so where next? While we will eventually make our way south down the Anduin, past the Emin Arnan to Pelargir, and look at Lasarnak and the other regions of South Gondor, I want to look at Ithilien first, and that's going to mean a visit to Osgiliath, which will have its own episode next week. And with the time I have left today, though, let's look at a place that, like Osgiliath, is literally between Anorion and Ithilien, the Isle of Caer Andros. Now, the first time we hear about it is in the chapter The Siege of Gondor, when Faramir is telling his story about meeting Frodo and Sam to Denethor, Gandalf, and Pippin. Faramir is trying to explain why he couldn't have arrived any sooner, saying, Yestereve I lay at Caer Andros, the long isle in the river northward, which we hold in defense. Okay, the long isle. How long is this long isle? Well, using the scale on Tolkien's maps, it appears to be about 10 miles long. It's a big island. It's located about 50 miles north of Minas Tirith and was of massive strategic importance. Denethor makes it clear that an attacking force cannot cross the Anduin north of Caer Andros because of the marshes. Osgiliath is, in fact, the only other place an army could cross the Anduin, unless they marched all the way north to the Undeeps. Now, in fact, it is this strategic importance that leads Gondor to fortify the island, possibly as early as 1248, when Minalcar fortified the west shore of Anduin as far as the inflow of the Limelight. That doesn't really say that he fortified the island there, but certainly that's further south than the inflow of the Limelight. Now, we do know that for sure it was manned by 1944 when King Ondahare was defeated by the Wainriders, as we learn in Cirion and Eorl. With these forces, he, that would be Adrihil of Dol Amroth, was to take up a defensive position between Caer Andros, which was manned, and the mountains of Efelduath. Also, Amundine, the first of the Beacon Hills, was built with Caer Andros in mind, as we read in a footnote about the beacons in that same story. Amundine, the Silent Hill, was perhaps the oldest beacon, with the original function of a fortified outpost of Minas Tirith, from which its beacon could be seen, to keep watch over the passage into North Ithilien from Dagorlad, and any attempt by enemies to cross the Anduin at or near Caer Andros. Now, later, somewhere around 3rd Age 2900, the steward Turin II also fortified again the Isle of Caer Andros to defend Anorion, as we learn in Appendix A. And a footnote to that passage gives us our last description of the island for today, as well as a little bit of word nerdery. This name means ship of long foam, for the isle was shaped like a great ship, with a high prow pointing north, against which the white foam of Anduin broke on sharp rocks. Now, next week, we will take a look at the former capital of Gondor and the only other place south of Caer Andros where an army could cross the Anduin, the ruined city of Osgiliath. For now, though, folks, that wraps it up for this week's Middle-earth Map Monday. A big thank you to those of you who support the TTT on Patreon. Your support gives me what I need to create these episodes, and I'm closing in on 600 of them. Thank you, especially right now. I know that things are hard for so many people with the shutdown and things happening in the economy. So I just want you to know I really do appreciate it, and I don't take it for granted. Now, if you're not yet supporting the show, please consider doing that. Visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as we continue in the revised letters on Tolkien Tuesdays. You know the routine by now. Subscribe to the TTT in your podcast apps or to this channel here on YouTube. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.